Hello, everyone. My name is Phyllis Raphulu, and I'm joined by Thedi Legau. Welcome to our session today. And we're going to take you through the early warning requirement for Cat I FSPs that collect premiums, Cat II FSPs, Cat 2A, Cat 3, and Cat 4 FSPs. I'll hand over to Thedi so that he can take us through his part of the presentation. Over to you, Thedi.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. The discussion today will be based on Section 49 of Chapter 6 in terms of Board Notice 194. We will be looking at the general solvency requirement as well as the working capital requirement. This does not apply to key individuals as well as representatives who are natural persons, as well as registered banks and insurers. So we'll be going through some examples and as well as the information pertaining to that aspect. In terms of the assets regarding pertaining to the general solvency, we will be deducting from the general assets, goodwill, intangible assets, as well as investments to related parties for in order to be obtain the actual value or the actual assets value of a particular FSP. From the liability side, we will be deducting loans subordinated in favor of other creditors. So those will be deducted from there to obtain the actual liabilities of a particular FSP. Additional requirements in terms of the general solvency and the working capital requirement are as follows. So in terms of category 1 and 4, the requirement is that the current assets must exceed the current liabilities. In terms of category 2, the current assets must exceed the current liabilities as well. However, in terms of category 2A and category 3, in addition to current assets exceeding the current liabilities, the assets of the FSP must exceed the liabilities by at least 3 million. At any given point in time. So at that particular financial reporting. When early warnings are triggered, in terms of Section 49 of the determination of fit and proper, early warning will be triggered where the assets of an FSP or the juristic rep exceeds the liabilities by less than 10%, or the current assets of an FSP exceed the current liabilities by less than 10%, or when an FSP becomes aware that it does not meet these requirements set out in this chapter, or it becomes aware of a situation that will lead to it not being able to meet these requirements, the FSP should notify the FSCA in writing, where the unauthorized person have signed off on that written notification to the FSP to inform us that the FSP will not be able to meet these early warnings, or rather the early warnings have been triggered. However, when the early warnings have been triggered, the FSP should not engage in the following: make payment by way of a loan, advances, or bonus, or dividends payments, or repayments of capital, or distribution of assets to any director, officer, partner, shareholder, or related party without written prior approval from the registrar, meaning that the FSP would need to engage with the FSCA regarding its intention to distribute or make any aforementioned payments. My colleague will be taking us through the examples as to how we go about making such calculations. Over to you, Phyllis.
Thank you, Thedi. I'll take you through how to detect the early warning sign for category 1 FSPs that collect premiums, category 2 and category 4. Then on the later stage, I will take you through the how to detect the early warning sign for category 2A and category 3. So here in this slide, we have FSP ABCD Ltd with the FSP number 12345 that we're going to use as an example. So we have the general solvency requirement and the working capital requirement. So on the total assets, we're going to less the goodwill, intangible assets, investment in related parties, and loan to related parties, as Thedi has mentioned before, in order to get the adjusted assets. Then on the total liabilities, we're going to less subordinated loan, which will give us the adjusted liabilities. Then after that, we're going to take the adjusted assets and less adjusted liabilities in order to get the net adjusted assets. So in our example here, how are we going to see if the early warning sign has been triggered? In the year 2021, the early warning sign was triggered. For example, in the general solvency requirement, the net adjusted assets exceeded adjusted liabilities by less than 10%, which is 7%. And then the requirement says the net adjusted assets must exceed adjusted liabilities by more than 10%. So that's why we're saying the early warning requirement is triggered in 2021, because the net adjusted asset exceeded adjusted liabilities by 7%. And then in the working capital below, in 2021, the early warning requirement was triggered because the current asset exceeded current liabilities by 9.5%, while it was supposed to be more than 10%. So in this instance, in the year 2021, the FSP has to notify the authority that the early warning requirement has been triggered. And I'll take you through what has to be submitted together with the notification. And then in 2022, the FSP met financial soundness requirement and the early warning requirement was not triggered. And in this instance, the FSP doesn't have to send any notification to the FSCA. And for Cat 2A and Cat 3, we're going to use FSP EFG Ltd with the FSP number 3456. So we have financial year end 2019 and 2020. And then the requirement for general solvency requirement differs with the requirement for category 1 FSP that collect, category 2, category 4, because in this Cat 2A and Cat 3, there is an additional requirement that requires the FSP to have assets that are more than liabilities with an excess of 3 million. So in 2020, the early warning requirement was not triggered because the net adjusted assets on the general solvency exceeded adjusted liabilities by more than 10%. And on the working capital, the current asset exceeded liabilities by 20%, which is more than 10%. So in 2020, the FSP doesn't have to send the notification to the authority. And then in 2019, the early warning requirement was triggered in both general solvency requirement and in working capital requirement. So why am I saying the early warning requirement was triggered on the general solvency requirement? It's because the net adjusted assets exceeded the adjusted liabilities by less than 10%, which is 1.12%. And in the working capital requirement, the current assets exceeded current liabilities by 5%, which is also less than 10%. So in 2019, the FSP has to notify the authority that their general solvency requirement triggered the early warning requirement, and also the working capital requirement triggered the early warning requirement. Then what is it that the FSP have to send together with the notification to the authority if the early warning requirement has been triggered? They have to submit the copy of the latest management account that will demonstrate the most updated financial position of the FSP, and also a copy of remedial action plan. So the remedial action plan must include the strategy or initiatives that the FSP will focus on in avoiding being in a position to contravene early warning sign requirement. The time that will take the FSP to remediate the early warning sign requirement, and then the income statement items that the FSP will focus on in order to increase profitability and inherently owner's equity. And then the remedial action that we mentioned above must be implemented, and then it must be evident in the next annual financial statement submission. That will take us to the end of our session today. Thank you for joining us. My name is Phyllis Raphulu, and I was joined by Thedi Legau. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.